Good morning or good afternoon. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory out in Seattle. We're very pleased to have you attend this webinar. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about what we know about data that have been collected around marine renewable energy devices, specifically wave and tidal devices. And then we will be showing you data sets and information that come from that kind of monitoring. We're going to talk about our data transferability process and our next steps. So just to step back a moment, who are we? What are we doing here? We are with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We are one of the U.S. Department of Energy's national labs. We happen to be the only one that has a marine laboratory out on the Pacific coast in Sequim, Washington. So we do work very closely on marine issues. We are funded by the Department of Energy Water Power Technology Office, which is part of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at DOE. And the Water Power Office is responsible not only for marine energy development, but also for hydropower. Now, the U.S. legislation uses the acronym MHK, or Marine and Hydrokinetic Energy. More commonly internationally, Marine Renewable Energy, or MRE, is used, so we'll use that pretty much throughout this presentation. Today, we are representing an international consortium, goes by the not very useful name of NX4. This is a collaborative task under International Energy Agency Ocean Energy System, or OES. This is a collaboration of 25 nations plus the European Commission who come together with the interest of developing marine renewable energy as a low-carbon, sustainable, reliable energy source. Of those 25 nations, 15 have joined this particular collaborative looking at environmental effects of marine energy. One of the areas that we have focused on this past year and a half or so is this idea of data transferability and collection consistency, and that's really the topic here today. So, why are we talking about this? There's a perception among the marine renewable energy industry that it takes a very long time to get projects in the water, that permitting is long and complicated, and that they are being asked to provide very extensive data sets, both for baseline data and pre-installation work, and then after installation that the monitoring requirements are extensive. And they're particularly spooked that there may be major mitigation requirements coming down the road. It's also our perception that you in the regulatory, permitting, management, and policy community are facing a lot of challenges too. There's not a lot of devices in the water at this point. These are new technologies we don't know a great deal about, and there's a lot of uncertainty about potential environmental effects. At the same time, your mandates are to protect the marine environment, to follow all federal and state laws, and you have to make decisions on applications when they cross your desk. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of challenge here. So what we firmly believe is that by getting devices in the water, we're going to learn a great deal more, but obviously that has to be done in a responsible manner. So we have developed what we've called this data transferability and collection consistency, but what do we mean by this? So our hypothesis is, if there are data or information that have been collected through research studies and monitoring from projects that are already in the water, this should be helpful in informing your decisions on the next permitting applications. We recognize that for every new project, some site-specific data must be collected, but it is really our goal to try to make sure that existing data are used to the greatest extent possible, that they're discoverable, that they are available to you. And the hope here is this will reduce the site-specific data collection requirements. Similarly, there are other industries that have similar potential effects on the environment, and we need to learn from those analogs. We call this the data that are available could then be transferred to these new projects so that there can be some learning taking place. But we also recognize there has to be a consistency in the way the data are collected, or they're really not comparable. So a couple of definitions. First of all, marine renewable energy, we are talking wave and tidal, but MRE also includes energy generated from ocean currents, river currents, ocean thermal energy conversion, that is the gradient between warmer and colder water, especially in the tropics, and also you can generate energy from gradients in salinity. In case you're not familiar with it, I do want to introduce you to TESIS. There's the URL up there. There's the front page of it. This is a knowledge base that's developed and maintained here at PNNL that has extensive resources in this area. So if you're not familiar, please do visit, get on our mailing list, etc. Okay, so finally, what do we mean by data when we say data transferability? We really mean data and information. It could be raw data or quality assured data, but it's probably, for your uses, probably even more commonly data that have been analyzed, interpreted, reports, and so on. So we're trying to use that term data to be inclusive of all that. So what are we doing today? We are going to walk through different types of data that represent the major interactions of concern, particularly these 6. Collision risk, which is, of course, mostly around turbines with animals, the effects of underwater noise on animals, effects of electromagnetic fields from cables and devices, changes in habitats, and also fish attraction, reefing, etc., changes to physical systems, circulation, energy removal, etc., and barrier effects to animals. Then we're going to present towards the end our data transferability process and get your thoughts. And throughout this, we're going to pause and really ask for your questions, comments, involvement. We'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. And then we'll end up with next steps. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues. First of all, Michaela Freeman, who is a policy analyst and science analyst here at PNNL. So Michaela is going to talk about collision risk and present to you some of the data that has been collected around already permitted projects, largely in Europe, but not entirely, and you'll give you a sense of what we know and what we don't know. And following that, Alicia Gordon, who is a research scientist here at PNNL as well, will take on some of the others, and we'll do a little trading back and forth. So, Michaela, why don't you go ahead with collision risk?
Okay, thank you, Andrea. So one note I want to mention on these introductory slides we have is a lot of the data and information we're showing you today is from some of our colleagues who've been wonderful enough to let us share their data and information that they've collected. So please note that these are shared with permission, of course. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm going to talk about collision risk. So here what we're looking at is largely pertaining to tidal turbines. Really what we're concerned with is the rotating blades of tidal turbines causing harm, whether that be injury or death, to marine mammals, fish, and diving seabirds. And in the right environment, it could be sea turtles as well, but we're really going to focus on these other 3. We care because of the effects on these populations as a whole, but what we look for are the effects on individuals. For collision risk, we don't have analogs from other industries because though conventional hydropower or ship propellers might look similar, they're actually quite different. So hydropower turbines are much faster, and when you look at a dam, there's really only space through that turbine for fish or whatnot to get through in a small space, whereas a tidal turbine might be situated in a channel where there's space to go around the turbine. Ship propellers are putting out lots more energy into the water. They're moving faster, and they allow for a ship to move laterally much faster than an animal can respond to. So again, while these look similar, they aren't quite analogs, and they don't really inform us much about collision risk with tidal turbines. Here, what we know is that animals may come into close contact just through their normal movements. They may be attracted to a device for shelter or for feeding, and they may actually be unable to avoid a device depending on certain factors such as how strong the tidal currents are, or if you have a fish versus a marine mammal and how strong that animal is to fight those currents. So what I'm going to show next is a series of videos to give an idea of how tidal turbines move and how it looks to see an animal come close to these devices. So this first video is from the Atlantis Andritz turbine, and there are no animals in this video with the turbine, but I wanted to start off by just showing you what these look like underwater. So the turbine is in the middle there. You can see it out of the water with the 3 blades, and then these 2 videos you see show the speed of the turbine. It's moving quite slowly, so you can see that this is different from a ship propeller or whatnot that's moving much faster. The Andritz turbine was deployed at the European Marine Energy Center in Pentland Firth, Scotland. And this is the shallowest turbine at 35 meters. They're going to build out deeper, and there may be additional turbines in the water. This next video is the Voith turbine, also at EMEC, and in the upper left-hand corner of this video, you can actually see some fish swimming around this moving turbine. And really the point here is to show that there are fish swimming around, and they look pretty unperturbed by the moving turbine, again, which is moving fairly slow. This is a slightly smaller turbine than the Andritz one I showed you, but it's also deployed at 35 meters, and again, we have a picture of it out of the water so you can see what the full device looks like. This next video comes from the Ocean Renewable Power Company, their RidGen turbine. And as you just saw, potentially there was a flash of silver, which was a fish swimming by. This video shows the turbine not moving yet, so just so you can see the current and how quickly that's moving. This turbine was deployed outside of Electromagnetic, Alaska. It's a cross-flow horizontal axis turbine, so it looks a little bit different than those 3-bladed turbines I showed in the previous slides. And although the turbine's not moving, I think this video gives us a good example about the instruments that are necessary when trying to monitor these different interactions. You can see this is kind of a low-quality video, so they actually use a series of low-cost security cameras underwater, and this really has been a learning experience about what monitoring equipment to use. That can be a really important factor in getting a better understanding for these interactions, such as collision risk. This next video is also of the ORPC RidGen turbine with the turbine moving. And towards the end of this video, right there, you'll see some silver flashes through the screen. And so this is showing the fish swimming through. There's strong currents, the turbine's moving, but we have a pretty good indication that the fish are going through or around the turbine without harm. And as I mentioned with the monitoring equipment, one of the challenges with collision risk is really being able to get a good sense of what's going on around the turbine, so this sort of information is really helpful. This next example I'm going to show you is slightly different. It comes from the Adaptable monitoring package that comes out of the University of Washington Pacific Marine Energy Center. And what you're seeing in this video here is the AMP Adaptable Monitoring Package, just to get an idea of what this looks like. And what this is the platform for multiple sensors to be able to monitor around a tidal turbine and see what's going on. And so I want to show you this to see what sort of monitoring data and information can be available. And when we look at the examples, we'll pretend that this AMP is kind of a tidal turbine with the animals coming in close to it. But this is a really good example of what information is available. The important part here is we've really learned it's good to have multiple instruments when you're looking at collision risk, and this AMP consists of several different sonars, video cameras, and passive acoustic monitoring equipment. And the idea here is that you start with the cruder instruments that includes passive acoustic monitoring in case there's marine mammal vocalization. That would then alert the system and trigger the wider view of active acoustic sonars, which would determine that a target's coming in, and then that would hand it off to a narrower view, such as a targeted acoustic camera or a still frame camera, which you'll see. And so I'm going to show you a few examples. This was deployed in Swim Bay at our Marine Science Lab here at PNNL. This first example shows the active acoustic monitoring multi-beam sonar, and the red line is tracking a seal so that you can see that seal moving across the screen of what the AMP was able to see. This second example is the same thing, but shows a group of fish coming in right there, and when the light goes off, that is a strobe light that illuminated, and you can see the fish scatter after that. This third one, again, is the same instruments being used. You can see a seal coming in from the right side. We think it came in to grab a fish. And what I wanted to show with all of these is it's pretty nice pieces of data to get a sense of what's happening. However, it's not always super clear to know exactly that it's a seal coming in, and so that's really where this AMP and the different types of monitoring equipment it has are really helpful. So in this example, if you look on the left side, our seal example, if you see the small red box, it looks like a blob blown up a little bit to the red box on the left. It still looks like a bit of a blob. And so it's really difficult to tell that this is a seal. And so what happened is the seal was swimming in. It was picked up by the multi-beam sonar that then triggered an optical camera, and that took this still image you see on the right side, and that's much more detailed, allowing us to tell that this was a seal coming in. On the right side, our bird example, again, the two red boxes look like a blob. This kind of looks similar to our seal example on the left, but when you get that still image, you can see pretty clearly that that is a bird coming in instead of a seal. And so this is really important to see the different pieces of information that you can get from these different equipment and see how these can be pieced together to give us a better picture and better understanding of what we're seeing around these tidal turbines. So based on that data and information we showed you, I want to ask you guys a series of questions, and you'll see these throughout the presentation. I wanted to also note that if you had RSVP'd to the event, I sent you a little handout, and that has the same series of questions, and we want to make sure you guys are able to give us any feedback you have, and so we've provided that handout with the same questions if you prefer to write your feedback down and send it to us later. We'll also ask these questions at the end of each set of data and information we show you. And then we do also have an online survey with the same questions if you want a little bit of extra time to kind of mull over what you saw and then provide your feedback. But really the whole point of today is to hear from you what your thoughts are. And again, you can use the chat function, or you can feel free to speak up and ask questions. If your line is muted on your own, make sure you unmute yourself first. So the questions we want to, or the answers we want to hear from you today are, what do these data tell you? If you were to see these pieces of information for permitting, would these data be applicable in your jurisdiction, and what could you use? Additionally, is there anything that's missing or lacking from the data and anything else you might need to satisfy monitoring data requirements? And then as you see this data and information, is there background information you need to really set the context for the data you see? So at this point, I will hand the presentation over to my colleague, Alicia Gorton.
Thanks, Michaela. All right, everyone, my name is Alicia Gorton, and next we're going to talk about effects of underwater noise. And the information excuse me, and data that we're going to see in this section is courtesy of our colleagues, Brian Pelagi from University of Washington, Packwave and Partners. Next slide, please. All right, so underwater noise. So we know that marine animals use sound the way that terrestrial animals use light for sight and vision, and so obviously sound is key to their communication and navigation. This can induce behavioral changes, and also there's potential physical harm to animals from loud sounds underwater. And so here today we're talking about operational noise. We think that issues around installation-related noise is a different issue and can be dealt with separately. However, here we're going to focus on continuous operational noise. And so just to put this in perspective, we know that noises from shipping and other industries in the marine environment are actually much louder than MRE technologies. They may not be continuous, but they're much higher in amplitude. And so overall, we believe that the noise generated from MRE technologies is unlikely to cause harm to marine animals, and we'll show you some evidence for that in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so here, again, just to put this in perspective, We're going to show some examples of some regulatory thresholds for underwater sound for both marine mammals and fish. This information is courtesy of NOAA. There's a lot of information here, and the main takeaway is that for marine mammals, the lowest threshold is around 153 dB, and for fish, the lowest threshold is around 150 for behavioral effects. And so I just want you to keep those numbers in mind, 153 and 150 for marine mammals and fish respectively, and keep that in mind in the next few slides where we talk about how underwater noise from MRE technologies compare to these thresholds. Next slide, please. So the first example today we're going to look at is the OpenHydro turbine that was, tested at EMEC. I just want to remind everyone that you should have received an email with some slides that actually have these sound files embedded in them. So you can go back and play those later to really hear what these technologies sound like. So for the sound that's coming from the Tidal turbine, from the power takeoff, which is really within 2 meters of the technology, you hear a slight hum, not very loud. And so when you're listening to that, just keep in mind that that sound was recorded underwater and we're playing it back in air, so it doesn't. So the sound may be a little bit different. And so one of the kind of common outputs from this sound you'll see here shows the amplitude of the turbine on the y-axis in dB. And you can really see the takeaway here is that the peak of that sound coming from the turbine peaks around 132. And again, think back to the previous slide where we saw those thresholds for marine mammals about 153 and for fish about 150. So you can see here that the amplitude of the sound coming from the turbine is actually much less than the thresholds for marine mammals and fish. And also, shipping noise is generally around 150 to 180. So again, the sound that's being generated from these tidal turbines is both less than shipping and also much less than the thresholds for marine mammals and fish. Next slide, please. So the next example, we're going to take a look at the Fred Olsen Lifesaver. This was tested at Hawaii Wet. It's a point absorber. It's actually a toroid or a donut shape, and it has a pretty shallow draft of about ½ meter deep. We're going to take a look at one of the acoustic spectrums from this device on the next slide, please. Okay, so the plot in the background is a little bit different than the slide we previously saw. We're looking at the frequency on the y-axis, over time on the x-axis, so we're actually looking at a 30-second clip, and the colors are related to how loud the sound is. So the lower sounds, the quieter sounds are in the darker red or black, and then louder sounds are in yellow and white. And we're going to take a look at a snapshot at around 23 to 25 seconds. Again, you can listen to that on the slides that were sent to you. And that sound you're going to hear for just a couple of seconds is the power takeoff. And we've estimated that power takeoff is between 50 hertz and 700 hertz, and we've kind of outlined that area on that chart that popped up. And again, the takeaway here is that even for the power takeoff, you can see the peak is around maybe 85-ish dB. So again, the takeaway is that it's well below those thresholds for marine fish and also much less than the shipping noise, which is around 150 to 180. Next slide, please. We're going to take a look at the same output from the Fred Olsen, and we're going to take a look at a previous snippet at around 8 to 9 seconds. Here, excuse me, you can see some stripes that go up and down that one subset of that time, and those, they look like kind of zebra stripes, and if you listen to the clip from this specific example, you'll hear almost like a chirping sound, You may think it could be a marine mammal, but it's actually a damaged bearing. And so you can see here that we've identified that frequency range for the damaged bearing. And again, just keep in mind that even though that part is damaged and is generating some higher noise, it's still well below the thresholds of the 150 and 153 for marine mammals and fish, and also, again, well below the sound for shipping. And this is extremely important because the developer obviously doesn't want to have a damaged bearing or any other non-fully functional parts, so being able to measure the acoustic output will become just part of their common practice to measure the health of these technologies. And so this is a great opportunity for us to work with them to kind of figure out how we can integrate other parts of environmental monitoring with the monitoring that they're already going to be doing. So next slide, please. Thank you. One last slide to just wrap this up. This slide is really just to remind us that across the frequency range for all of these things that operate in the marine environment, such as shipping, seismic surveys, pile driving, sonar, oil and gas, that there is something that can hear it underwater. And so the marine environment is just a very noisy landscape. And so it's extremely important for us to be able to understand how MRE technologies really kind of fit in to this noisy landscape and be able to put in perspective the frequency range and also kind of the sound level at which they operate while keeping in mind those thresholds that we previously talked about. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, now it's time for us to open it up for a conversation with you to get some feedback on some of the information and the data that you just saw about underwater noise. What does this data tell you? If you were reviewing a permit application, is this sort of information relevant to what you would need while reviewing your application? Is there anything missing or lacking? What else would you need as you're kind of going through your review process? Okay, well, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrea Copping, and she is going to talk next about effects of electromagnetic fields.
Thanks, Alicia. Okay, on to another interaction that has gotten a lot of play in recent years around marine renewables and offshore wind development, which is a little funny because we have, in fact, had cables in the ocean for a very long time, but there is a lot of renewed interest. I'm going to show you, instead of data as it's been collected so far, I'm going to show you the results of a number of research studies that have been carried out in this field, many of them funded by BOEM, but also the Department of Energy and overseas, and I do want to credit Ann Bull and her group for doing a lot of this. Okay, why don't you go ahead. So, we know that electromagnetic field, EMF signatures, come from many human activities, including simply the presence of infrastructure, large amounts of metals like cables and bridges and tunnel abutments and all that. So it's a little bit mixed up there in the marine environment as it is on land. And marine renewable energy devices, the export cables are likely to be emitting EMF, as are moving parts of the devices, and if there were underwater substations, transfer stations, transformers, et cetera, they would as well. And we worry about this because many organisms use the natural magnetic field of the Earth for navigation, for orientation, for hunting, although it's important to note that there are only some species that have the receptors, both the electrical and the magnetic receptors, to be sensitive. Many of them don't, and they simply cannot detect these fields. There are certain types of elasmobranchs, certain sharks, skates, and rays that do have these receptors, as do a number of crustaceans. Sea turtles and some fish species, we know use the magnetic field to some extent, but what receptors are being used and whether they are likely to be affected by anthropogenic EMF fields is really not known. So far, what we've seen in a nutshell is there's no demonstrable impact of EMF on these sensitive species, but I want to walk you through what we do know. Okay, So just a little refresher that EMF comes in both, electricity comes in both alternating currents and direct currents. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the difference in the fields matters in seawater. It's quite different than it is in freshwater or in air or in soil, because the marine water shorts out the electrical field very quickly. What we have existing is the magnetic field and the induced electric field from the current from the magnetic field. And it differs in size, in orientation, and so on, whether it's AC or DC, how large the amount of current being carried, and how well the cable is shielded. Now, there's a whole series of literature studies that have looked at this EMF in the marine environment. There was a very big study done by Normando et al. Almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago now, funded by BOEM, and this is a big tome that's got a lot of very important information in it pulled together. And there's also a little bit that we know about behavioral effects on specific species, but it's quite limited. What we found through the Normando studies, when you pull everything we know together, we do know that the cable design, the depth to which it is buried or not in the seafloor, how much the sheathing allows for magnetic permeability, and how big the load is. Not kind of what we already knew, but it's very good information to look up. And also helps with, there's a lot of good indicators of how to model these fields. Next. In terms of laboratory studies, a good deal of this was done in our lab here at PNNL. We set up experiments with a number of marine species with a control and an experimental tank, good-sized tanks, and we saw very little evidence to indicate distinct or extreme behavioral responses. There were behavioral responses. We used a pretty high EMF level of 3 millitesla or 3,000 microtesla for the species we used. We saw some developmental and physiological responses. For example, we used both Pacific and Atlantic halibut and took them through some developmental stages. And we actually saw the developmental delays at the very early stages from egg to larvae, but they caught up quite quickly later on, so that was interesting. And they were not statistically significant. We saw when we used Dungeness crab and also American lobster that they definitely knew when the field was turned on. They sat up and took notice. The first time the lobster were exposed, they went to the other end of the tank. These were pretty good-sized, tanks, water tables. A day later, when we turned the field on, they paid no attention. So we saw some very quick acclimation in many of them. There were other fish species we were unable to get decent data on. For example, larval salmon. They're simply too spooky. They just were too difficult to deal with and really determine you were looking at an EMF response rather than just a sort of a captivity response. So there's lots more work that could be done there, but what we didn't see was any tremendously strong responses. Next one. In terms of field studies, there's a whole series of them going back more than 10 years. One of the very iconic ones done by the Cowrie, which was a big offshore wind program prior in the UK, done by Andrew Gill with his group. They put mesocosms out in the field with an energizer and a control cable with a lot of animals trapped in there. And what they saw was that the tap sharks, we call them dogfish over here, certainly knew that the cable was there, sat up and took notice, but they didn't seem to have positive or negative effects. They went and examined it, and that was sort of it. Same with a number of other elasmobranchs like skates, benthic ones. There was a study done by Westerberg and Landerfeld in 2008 where they put acoustic trackers in European eels, which is a species of concern in Europe, and had them looked at them swimming back and forth across an energized cable. The animals definitely knew there was something there. They slowed down, they took a look, but they kept going, so there was no sort of evidence of a barrier effect there. There was a study done by BOEM in Southern California out to some of the oil rigs where there are cables out to provide hotel power for the rigs because they can no longer burn off oil and gas to supply power. for air quality reasons. And then they also looked at a non-energized cable and went down the submersible and took a look to see what kind of different groups, habitats, animal species were living there, and really could see no difference. The best thing that came out of that study, I think, was some really good measurements of the EMF in the cable that helped to calibrate some of the modeling efforts. Next one. Marvin was a large project in the North Sea in Europe, and they measured EMF from cables and the wind turbines themselves on a series of quite shallow wind turbines, and got some very good measurements and developed some new instrumentation that does a lot better job measuring this. And what they saw was you could definitely pick up the export cable and the EMF signals there. You could also pick up some EMF from the actual turning wind turbines in the air into the water, but it was quite weak. And it does appear that frequency-wise there are outputs from these cables in the frequency ranges where some of these species doesn't take notice. But again, they don't seem to be very, there doesn't seem to be any very distinct responses. Next one. This is a project funded by BOEM in Long Island Sound, where they put a number of big cages down on the bottom, again trapping a number of different species, and they were able to track the movements of the species within these cages with and without EMF. They saw some subtle changes in behavior, again with American lobster, again looking at species that are of recreational or commercial importance. They saw skates, again elasmobranchs had some strong responses, and they may have been restricted a little in their movement, but it does not appear to act as, these cables don't appear to act as a barrier. The EMF is not keeping animals from getting to where they want to go. Next. A similar kind of experiment was done with cages in Puget Sound with Dungeness crab, and also in the Santa Barbara Channel with red rock crab, with different sizes of cables. They were large cages that were baited on one end and sort of placed, as you can see from that diagram on the right, across the cable. And in both cases, the animals really didn't have trouble crossing that cable to get to bait. But if you've ever worked with crabs, you know not much gets in the way of food for them. So again, there didn't seem to be any barrier effect. So the question arose, what about migratory fish species? And there's quite a large cable moving its way through the middle of the San Francisco Bay. So and there's, of course, migratory salmon and also sturgeon. And the animals, both green and white sturgeon, and of course green sturgeon are endangered, as are some of the salmon species. Using acoustic tags in the animals were tracked. One of the outcomes of this one, when they tried to find that cable using a magnetometer, what they found was there were so many other sources of EMF in the bay, it was very hard to find that energized cable a good deal of the time. These included things like bridges and so on. So I think this helps put in perspective what those EMF signatures out of these cables are like. And in any case, those animals seem to have no trouble. They went about their business as usual, crossing the cable. Okay. And that was a very, very quick gallop through what we know to date. Those papers, I believe, are all out, and we are putting a list of all those papers on the website where you can find these slides later on as well. So I want to pause there and ask if you have questions about the EMF work, which I will try to answer, not having done much of it myself. And also, is this helpful to you as you look at applications for permits? And this one obviously is very applicable to offshore wind as well as to wave and tidal. And what other data would you want to see? So on. Okay, well, no questions on EMF. I'm going to hand this back to Michaela Freeman, who's going to talk about changes in habitat.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea. So again, the videos and data here come from our colleagues Sarah Hinkle at OSU and Brian Pelagi at UW, both part of PMEC. So with Benthic habitat changes, what we're going to focus on here as far as habitat changes are considered is mostly those benthic changes. However, this does also include what's going on in the water column. So what we're looking at here is the presence of devices in any parts of the device, be that anchor lines or cables that are on the seafloor in the water column. Really anything you put in the environment will alter the habitat. So it's really just a question of does it matter and what are the impacts. If you do change habitat, it could change behavior, it could change the areas that animals inhabit. It could be a real concern if you're modifying or eliminating species from important habitats or changing the way of life. And this is particularly important for any listed species in the area. What's really useful here regarding habitat changes is there actually are a lot of analogs from other industries, and there's really nothing new about putting a marine renewable energy device in the ocean. So we can learn a lot from past anthropogenic items in the ocean, such as anchoring buoys or docks or whatnot. And so what we think here is the answer is it's all about the location you're using. So if it's a rare or if it's an important habitat, don't put your device there. For instance, if there's one rocky reef amongst a bunch of soft bottom, avoid that area. So it's really about siting devices properly. So I'm going to take you through a few videos. This first video comes out of PacWave, OSU, or near Oregon State University. And this is from a dredge taken about 50 meters deep. All the videos I'll show you today are on the West Coast. We have a very narrow shelf here, and much of it is soft bottom habitat. I think you'll find much of the same case if you go a little ways out in the Atlantic, though there's obviously a much more extensive shelf there. So on the West Coast, we have thousands of square miles of similar habitat to this. So we want to show you this video just to get a sense of what the benthos looks like here. And if you have a good benthic survey, which we assume would be required of developers, you can get a good sense of where to place your device and where not to. This next video is out of Grays Harbor, a little bit north in Washington. This video is 70 meters deep and, again, is showing the soft bottom habitat. There's definitely marine life here, but it's very little of that is rare marine life. We do have some deep water coral and sponges off the northwest coast, but we're just beginning to discover where they are, and they're a bit deeper than this. So again, it's really just understanding if you're looking in an area to site a device, avoiding those rare or important habitats. And again, we are simplifying it just for the case of being able to talk about this as far as examples in these soft bottom habitats. This last example shows a little bit of a different environment. This is from Admiralty Inlet in Puget Sound, so again, north of both the other two examples I showed. This is about 50 to 60 meters deep, and it's a cobble bottom habitat with quite a fast current, as you can see by the water moving around in the video. And this is a more typical example of where a tidal turbine would be sited. You can see that there is life down there, but it's not a terribly rich habitat, especially due to the fast-moving water. There are some places in the UK where they tend to put devices in a little bit more shallower water than we consider in the US, so they're worried about sand banks and some other issues. But on the whole, you tend to get these rocky bottom habitats in areas for tidal devices. So again, overall, what we're looking at here is it's really important in understanding what we already know about habitat changes. There have been some issues raised, such as the possibility of adding islands of hard bottom habitat in soft bottom areas, or that the devices could act as an invasive species pathway. But at this point, it's really more of a theoretical argument, and we do have a lot of understanding from buoys and various other items that have already been placed in the marine environment. So again, I want to take the time to ask you guys what the data tell you, if you'd be able to use any of this information, if that came across your desk, and then anything else that's lacking or missing that you've seen here, or any other questions you may have for us. All right, unless there's anything else, I will hand it back to my colleague Alicia, and she will talk to you guys about physical systems changes. So go ahead, Alicia.
Thanks, Michaela. All right, so next we're going to talk very quickly about physical system changes. There's not too much information available here, so we're really going to focus on a numerical modeling study done at PNNL by our colleagues Dr. Jiaojing Yang and Taiping Wang. Next slide, please. All right, so physical systems. The concern here, excuse me, is the effect of MRE on the physical system, so including changes in water flow, wave heights, really the overall hydrodynamics of the entire system. We know that there probably is an effect from a single technology. However, those effects are usually too small to measure, and they're usually below the natural level of variability. So really, we're not going to begin to see physical system effects really at a landscape scale until we begin to deploy more arrays. And so right now, the only tool we really have to rely on is numerical modeling, and we're going to show an example of that today. So next slide, please. So to provide an example, we've done some work here at PNNL, excuse me, looking at tidal turbines in the Puget Sound and the potential environmental impacts related to water circulation, to sediment transport, and water quality if enough turbines were placed in an array. There's been a lot of these studies done around the entire world and done at PNNL, and we're taking it really to the next level by looking at a realistic number of turbines in the model as opposed to just putting in an energy sink. However, the caveat here is that we are lacking validation data. So a lot of these models have been validated really well in terms of the hydrodynamics. However, the next step is really being able to put the array in the water to make sure we have some data to validate that aspect of the model. So next slide. So I'm going to show an example of putting in some tidal turbines in the Tacoma Narrows. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see kind of an aerial overview of the Puget Sound. Areas in red are areas of high tidal flows. So on the southeastern, the bottom right corner of the map, you'll see a little sliver of red, and that's actually the Tacoma Narrows. And then in the next image, we kind of blow that up. You can see the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And for the model, we added 10-meter turbines that are 10 meters off the seabed. And so for this particular model run, we're looking at 20 turbines in that farm. The next two images are kind of typical outputs from the numerical modeling. The first image, image A, shows the local effects of the turbines on the velocity. You can see there that the velocity does speed up a little bit. And then the image to the right, figure B, shows the effect of the turbines on the bed shear stress. So you can see that the stress on the bed does actually increase. And so the takeaway here are two things, really. First, that the increase in velocity and shear stress really isn't that big. It's not that big of an increase. And also, just notice how quickly these increases kind of dissipate back to background levels, where that darker blue is just really the normal movement of the water. And so these are just some kind of tools that could be helpful for assessing physical system changes. We've done some similar modeling studies in the area of the Puget Sound where we actually model 1,000 tidal turbines. Obviously, that's not very realistic, but it isn't really until you get to that large number of turbines where you really start to see an effect on circulation, on water quality, etc. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to open it up for conversation. Again, we don't have a lot of information to show. We're really relying on numerical modeling right now. So based on the information you saw, what does this information tell you? Would it be useful to you? Is there any other sort of output from these numerical modeling studies that would be useful to you? Is there anything lacking? So I'll open it up to you for a few minutes if you have any feedback. Well, with that, we're going to move on to our last stressor. We're going to talk about barrier effect. Next slide, please. So the concern here with barrier effect from MRE is the concern with animals kind of being displaced from their critical habitat, and the idea is that the MRE would really create a barrier where the animal would not be able to cross or move around the technology. And so, as we've talked about before, with physical systems, this concern really and the impacts here are more likely to happen or be a problem of concern when we actually have a deployment of arrays. And so as of right now, there's really no information available, but this is one that we'll have to come back. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Michaela so she can talk about some previous regulator feedback. Michaela?
Thanks, Alicia. So I just quickly wanted to go through some of the work we've done so far engaging the U.S. regulatory community. We've been doing this since about 2017 when we started with a regulator survey to try and understand any challenges that regulators are facing related to marine renewable energy and get some ideas how regulators are feeling about these concepts such as data transferability. And what we found is that people were willing to talk about data transferability, and that really led us to holding these workshops. So we actually held 5 of these similar workshops last year throughout the U.S. You can see we talked to 24 state and federal regulators in several different states. And we asked them the same exact questions, and we found a lot of very helpful feedback. What we really tried to understand is willingness to transfer data and better understanding needs. And so from showing the data, what we found is everyone we talked to wasn't necessarily looking for raw data, but rather they valued the videos and audio clips that we showed. And what we heard back was it really helped to increase understanding of these potential impacts and the way that we can monitor different environmental challenges. Particularly what I want to point out is during these 2018 workshops, we found that regulators were particularly interested in the noise data. That first graph I showed you from the OpenHydro turbine where you had the blue line and it showed that it was under those thresholds for marine mammals and fish. That was much more of a preference than those black and red graphs that were a little bit harder to understand if you don't have a background in underwater noise. And so it was really great to hear what sort of information those regulators we talked to valued over other ones. And so, again, we would love to hear any additional feedback you guys have either now or on the online survey that I'll send back. And overall, we found positive feedback on everything, and we kept hearing that regulators would like to be able to find data and information easier as they were going through the process of permitting potential devices, which has led us to working on an online tool. And they also like the idea of having data that's compatible with one another, which has led us to work on data collection consistency. And both of these ideas we'll present in more detail during our May workshops that will be kind of the next steps. And we'll build off of this workshop where we'll talk about the data transferability process and we'll move towards retiring risk. So I'll send an invitation for that out in about a week or so to you guys, so please be on the lookout for that. So I want to hand this back to Alicia to quickly go over our data transferability process.
Great, thanks, Michaela. You can go to the next slide, please. Great, so as Michaela and Andrea have talked about, the development of the data transferability process actually began a few years ago. It began with the development of a white paper that really outlined the proposed framework and several other components of the data transferability process. As Michaela mentioned, we vetted that proposed framework with regulators through a series of workshops and focus groups. We've presented at conferences, at workshops, and poster sessions, and we've incorporated a lot of the feedback from those opportunities into the data transferability process that we're going to talk about today. The data transferability process, as you can see in that graphic, consists of several parts. The main kind of overarching part of that process is the data transferability framework, which really is kind of the overarching principles that guide the process of data transfer. That's really what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. We also have this concept of data collection consistency, and that really just provides preferred measurement methods or processes to make sure that data from one project is compatible and consistent with another project. We have another concept of this monitoring data set discoverability matrix. We're still working on that, but that really will allow a practitioner to really discover data based on the approach that's presented in the framework. And then we have these best management practices that you can see kind of encompasses the framework and several of the other components related to data transferability and data collection consistency. And so in the next few slides, we're going to focus only on the framework. So next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So our framework for data transferability really consists of four things. Excuse me. So the first aspect of the framework is that it brings together data sets from already permitted consented projects in an organized fashion. Once that data is collected, then it can compare the applicability and how relevant each set of data is for use in permitting and consenting future projects. Next, we have that concept of data collection consistency, where we can really look at two projects and determine how consistently the data was collected. And then finally, the process just really guides the process of data transfer. And so the 6 stressors that we previously talked about really are kind of the foundation of our framework, and they're used to categorize data that's collected for a specific stressor. And so, for example, here you can see kind of the 4 variables that are used to kind of categorize a set of data. Those variables include the stressor, whether you're talking about collision risk or underwater noise, the receptor, whether you're talking about a marine mammal, fish, or diving birds, the condition of the site, whether you're in a shallow, narrow channel, a wide or deep channel, and then finally the technology type. Are we talking about wave or tidal, bottom-mounted, floating, etc.? And so if you move on to the next slide, please, I'll briefly talk about the guidelines for data transferability that kind of range from guidelines that are necessary and then scale down as you go down this list of things that would just be really nice to have in order to transfer data from one project to the next. So starting at the top, excuse me, we believe it's necessary that in order to transfer data from an already permitted consented site to a future project, that the interaction that you're looking at be defined by the same 4 variables. So they have the same stressor, the same receptor, same site conditions, and same technology type. And then also we want to make sure that the data were collected in a consistent manner. It's also very important that the project be of similar size, whether we're comparing an array to an array. So obviously the caveat here is that we don't have a lot of information on arrays yet. So this is more of kind of a desired future guideline. So we're going to have to come back to do this one once we have more arrays in the water. Next of importance, it would be really nice if the receptor species were either the same or closely related. So, for example, if you have a tidal turbine and concerns about gray seals, those concerns or the data collected for those gray seals could potentially be transferred or relevant for harbor seals. However, they probably would not be able to be transferred for a harbor porpoise. Moving down our list, next, it would be nice if you have a similar technology, not just wave, or tidal and tidal, but if you're looking at a point absorber and a point absorber, or if you're looking at an oscillating water column. And then finally, it would be desirable if the 2 sites shared a similar wave or tidal resource. So, for example, if data is collected in a slower tidal regime, then those data would be more comparable. So next slide, please. So I kind of went through the data transferability process extremely quickly. We only focused on our framework. There are a lot more components to the data transferability process that we're going to talk about in our May set of webinars. So as Michaela said, keep an eye out on your email for those. But right now we'll open it up for conversation. Based on the information you saw here about the data transferability process and the framework, does this make sense? Are the guidelines for data transferability useful to you? Would you use them? Would you be able to kind of make use of this framework? And if you have any other suggested groups or stakeholders that could be interested, you can let us know that also. Well, if there are no questions, then I will turn it back over to Michaela to talk about next steps and to wrap us up. Michaela?
Thanks, Alicia. So, as we've mentioned, we will be holding our next set of these workshops May 28th and May 30th at the same time. I'll be sending out the invitation for these shortly. And so these really build on the workshop today. We'll be discussing data transferability further, going into a little bit more detail about our process. And then we're also going to move towards this concept of retiring risk. So be on the lookout for that, and please feel free with any of these workshops to forward them along to your colleagues. We will put a recording of this workshop today on TPIS. We'll take out any of the discussion portion, but so that anyone can view this workshop at any time, we will have that on TPIS. What we're doing throughout this process is we started it in the U.S., as I mentioned, with our regulatory survey and these workshops, and we're working to move it to our 14 other Annex 4 countries and see how this process works. So we're starting out with some of these Annex 4 countries, carrying out the regulator survey. They've been translated in some cases and altered a bit to fit these different regulatory landscapes. And we are looking at the idea of holding an international workshop for our other country regulators. And even though each country has their own set of laws and regulations and frameworks, we believe there's enough commonalities between the countries and the problems that we're facing related to the marine renewable energy industry that we can come together and figure out how to move the industry forward in a responsible manner. And then the idea is that we'll present this process when we are to a more finalized point as a web-based tool on TPIS. And so we already have a little bit of this up on TPIS on our data transferability page, which you can see this link at the bottom here. So you can find any links to previous webinar recordings, previous workshop recordings, the workshop reports from the international workshop we held at the International Conference on Ocean Energy last year, and you can really follow the process that we've taken so far. So I do encourage you to visit that link. That's also where we will be posting the recording from today's workshop. So we do want to encourage you to visit there, and we really thank you guys for taking the time to hear the data information we have to show today and to provide your feedback. Again, I'll be sending an email with an online survey, so please do not hesitate to provide any feedback or comments or questions. And then I've also posted Andrea, Alicia, and my email addresses here, and you can contact us at any time if you have questions or whatnot. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.